Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and this is a quick tutorial on Lobbying 101. The idea is, I think a lot of people misunderstand the term lobbying, so I figured I'd explain it a little bit so that way we can talk about it better. So what lobbying is, the term lobbying just refers to reaching out to people of power and kind of advising them or expressing or advocating for a particular action. So when you call your local legislator and say, hey, I think you should vote this way on this bill, you are lobbying. So when people say, hey, lobbying is bad, it's like saying, hey, I shouldn't be able to reach out to my legislators and say, I think you should vote this way or that way. Now, what does happen is that people generally don't have enough time to lobby themselves. They got work days, they got families, they got other obligations, so they don't have time to be going to their state capital, the federal capital, their local city council meetings to lobby elected representatives and say, hey, you know what, I think you should do this. They barely have time to, let's say, lobby their own bosses to make changes around the workplace. Okay, so what people do is they may donate to organizations, oftentimes nonprofits, PACs, other organizations that share their views and say, you know what, I'm going to give them my money so that way they can take the time and the effort to advocate for X point of view. And then what they'll do is that they'll procure what's called a lobbying firm. Now, lobbying firms are generally firms that focus and say, hey, you know what? We have a staff of people who are oftentimes ex-politicians, so they have relationships with many of the politicians that are already on the Hill, okay, which means they're going to have much easier access because they're oftentimes friends and old compatriots, acquaintances, etc. There's existing relationships. This is the reason why politicians oftentimes go into either lobbying or investment banking, because these are two industries where basic success is really more about relationships. Like lobbying, your success in lobbying really going to be dependent on your relationship with the existing legislators. Investment banking is going to be dependent on your relationship with sort of wealthy people, which as a politician you develop with a relationship with both. So it's not, there's a little bit more context to the idea of the revolving door. It just so happens not only that the people with power have at times the right skill set for these other positions of power, aka relationships. But basically what happens is that these lobbying firms will be procured by these nonprofits, these PACs, these other organizations to advocate for their cause. And oftentimes these lobbying firms, they may represent a particular sort of perspective, or they'll advocate whatever you pay for them to advocate. Their job is just to get you access to that politician, make sure that they hear your side of the argument, and to make your side of the argument. And that's their job. Now, again, that's done by either they have existing relationships. Also, that's done by making political donations. So what happens, a lot of these organizations, what they do is they make sure that political donations are made to, national committees, to other PACs, to the candidates themselves. That alone doesn't necessarily get the legislator to vote the way they want them to vote, but oftentimes the price for a $10,000 dinner with a candidate, when they do these like high dollar fundraising events, that amount that's paid to go to the dinner allows them to be in an intimate setting where they can be with these legislators and then advocate. Okay, and say, hey, you know what? We really like it if you did this. And that still doesn't necessarily mean they'll vote that way, because at the same time, you have people on the opposite side doing the same thing, where they're paying to go to the dinners and lobbying and whatnot. So you have people from all sides of every argument doing the same thing. So when people say, oh, well, it's obvious that this particular... Now, what does happen, on top of that, is that during the elections, you have primaries in each party. And it's much easier to make sure you have a person in the office that's more likely to vote your way than to necessarily take someone who won and try to get them to vote your way. So where a lot more money and a lot more effort goes into is in that earlier on in the process, in the primaries, and trying to identify those candidates who are going to be much more amenable to your particular cause or whatnot. And this is kind of what becomes sort of very corrupting. Because what happens is that a lot of times candidates, they realize that it takes money to win an election. And again, even if you sat there and you said you limited donations, whatnot, it doesn't change the actual cost. Because at the end of the day, there's no good way to get in front of everybody, to get in front of everybody's ear, less so now than ever. Okay, once upon a time, we all watched the same channels. Now everyone watches different channels. They listen to different podcasts. They listen to different music and different mediums and different platforms. So in that case, there really isn't any kind of way to make sure that everyone's heard every candidate. So the cost of the advertising and the exposure and the influencers and whatnot, it can be very expensive. And it's going to be expensive whether you limit donations or not. You're just limiting sort of who can exercise that influence then. That's the problem with a lot of campaign finance reform, and I'll come back to that because that ties into this, because that's where a lot of the desire for campaign finance comes from. They're concerned that all these different lobbying firms will use these donations and basically build up a bench of legislators that sort of always vote their way. And because they become so dependent on those funds for the purposes of elections, that they fear not voting that way, which happens. That's the thing. Okay, that's the problem. When legislators have so much power to make decisions that impact so many different people in such sometimes financially huge ways, but just otherwise huge ways, that people are going to want to influence that power, and then there's going to be a huge, financial interest in doing so. And that's kind of where you end up getting the corruption. The corruption isn't the money itself. The corruption is the power. Okay, people are going to be like, well, there's this big power here. I want to use it. So the more power there is, the more financially it's worth corrupting that power or influencing that power, however you want to think about it. So that brings us to sort of campaign finance, where people want to create rules. But the problem is, a lot of these rules don't necessarily just eliminate the problem. They just make it harder to see, because when you see donations, you can kind of see who donated to who, and you can follow the paperwork. When you limit donations, then people go through other routes, whether it's through very subtle favors or, using a little influence to help your kid get to the right school or be part of the right program, or employing a family member or whatnot. There's all these other ways to sort of curry favor with someone. And it becomes less transparent, and they're supposedly so then they create rules regarding you have to disclose all gifts, and there's limits on gifts, and all this stuff, but then it just becomes very, very burdensome, okay? And then what happens is that where the money shifts to outside groups. So instead of giving to the candidate, you're giving to super PACs, because it's just much easier, and there's unlimited amounts, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what happens is, because there was so many rules within sort of giving to the candidate or the party, they don't get as much money as they used to. They're like, screw it, just give it to these outside groups, let them spend the money, and we'll just either spend it in support of the candidate or not, depending on whether they play ball. Now this has a couple problems, or it creates a couple of new problems. One, parties have a lot less control over their message, over their whatnot, so you kind of disempowered parties to an extent, and actually gave more power to the lobbying interests, because they get to decide the message, because it's their money that's being spent, instead of them giving it to the candidate and the candidate pushing their message but maybe voting a particular way. So you still end up with the same ends, that you have a candidate that votes a particular way, but now sort of the message that the public sees is going to be more skewed towards sort of the bigger moneyed interests. Two, also this makes it where incumbents are more likely to win, because generally who's more likely, basically a proven legislator, someone who's already won an election, is going to be a much safer investment than someone who hasn't won an election. So then what happens, you end up with these sort of very long time entrenched politicians who've been there for decades, because no one wants to donate to the other guy, because it just seems like a riskier investment. So oftentimes only the way non-incumbents win, the sort of that sort of fresh person, is not because a lot of people donate to them, because oftentimes they don't. Oftentimes it's maybe a few people who make a big donation and they take a chance, they take a risk on that person. That equalizes things and allows there to be more shakeup. And again, the fact that there's more competition within politics, regardless of what the individuals in that competition think, hold each other more accountable. It basically tells them that they can't, they have to be more careful with how they vote, with how they interact with their constituents, all this kind of stuff. So you can shuffle how the corruption happens by creating all sorts of campaign finance laws, but you're not preventing the corruption. The demand is there. The only way to really reduce corruption is to reduce the need for corruption. Okay, and there's two ways you do that. You decentralize power, so that way there's no particular place to corrupt. And two, just through the natural evolution of prosperity. Basically, as we become economically well off, as technology gets better, as we learn new ways to work and live together, more and more people will find themselves living comfortable enough in life that they don't feel a need. And again, it's not always about comfort. I get that. Okay, sometimes people are just doing it because they have a business and they want to grow that business, or they have this project, they want to grow that project. So it's not always about people's necessarily comfort in life. But again, where a lot of the funding for these things, that's partly due to several different individuals putting forward money. So the more prosperous we already are, the more decentralized power is, the less the demand for corruption will be. And I think that does pan out when you look at the world and you take a look at the places that are the most unfree, okay, where you see sort of the least prosperity. You're going to see more corruption because you have more people who are willing to take bribes, are willing to be influenced by campaign finance, donations and stuff like that. And in places where there's more centralized power, same idea. And oftentimes those two things go very hand in hand. So hopefully you guys found this interesting. My name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.